Hello, everybody. This is the Static Site Editor Group sync. This is the engineering focus edition. Today is the 17th of August, and happy Monday to everybody on the call. As usual, I'll start with a few quick FYIs. So Chad is out this week, and we'll be back next week, Monday, and Derek is out this week, Monday and Tuesday, and we'll be back on Wednesday. So, right, highlights from last week. So we enabled the static site editor link for all the pages in the handbook. So that's a great milestone for us. Again, thank you to everybody that made this happen. Thank you, Vasily, for jumping in and adding the feature flag for us as an extra safety net. For those that didn't see, Vasily enabled the feature flag action a few minutes ago, so that's all good now. And then also on the handbook side, Vasily added a custom helper that enabled us to split the performance indicator YAML file into smaller files, which will definitely, which made a lot of people very happy, because that's probably the one file that receives the most conflicts from edits and so on. So that was a nice win for us as well. On the general front, so this week we're starting with milestone 13.4. Our main focus should be getting momentum with our deliverables. I reviewed the priorities with Enrique and Vasily today, and I think we've got a good milestone planned, an ambitious one, but also a very nice one that I think if we can land most of what we talked about, it will be a really great milestone with lots of nice release notes to go into the release post. A reminder also, tomorrow's company group call is going to be run by Eric and features the static site editor. So please, let's make sure we're present and support Eric, and make ourselves available to help field any questions that might arise. All right, I'm going to change a tradition and skip the static site editor product updates from engineering, because I want to keep that one for last. We don't have a long agenda today, so I want us to finish the rest and then come back to that. So our main focus is editing front matter in 13.4, and we're doing some planning on that this week. So I wanted to just kind of like have a discussion while we have so many people synchronously on the call, that we can use the time for that. On the handbook side, so the monorepo refactor work is done and ready. We discussed last week, Chad, Lauren, myself, and we made the sensible call not to try and rush it in last week, but we're going to wait for Chad to be back from his PTO. And so on next week, Monday, after 6 p.m. PST, we'll pull the trigger and migrate the files, and then we will have a clean repo with 2 isolated sites from a code point of view, more or less. There's some shared files that we need to work on over time, but considering where we were back in January when we took over kind of like technical support for the handbook and stuff, there's been so much cleanup that's happened, and yeah, it's exciting to see it progress to that. So I've linked to the rollout plan, so you can have a look there. GitLab doc. So I haven't updated this section yet, but I'll quickly give an update here. So I chatted with Vasily today, and he has some issues that he needs to wrap up this week. And then from next week, hopefully he'll start firstly on the tier status badge in the header to wrap that work up. And following that, we'll be working on the issue around switching the internal help links in GitLab to the external GitLab docs URL. With that will come an admin setting for people to choose which documentation source to use, either the internal help or an external site, which will default to the GitLab docs website. And that's so that people that are in air-gapped instances can at least still use /help. And then once we get to the point where you can host your own doc site, and we deprecate help, that's where you will put in your URL for your external hosted or internal hosted docs as well. So that issues a bit of a kind of like a precursor to being able to roll out offline support for docs. All right, Eric Eastwood, GitHub update for us.
Okay, so finally, user data export is complete. Been working on that for a couple weeks, and now working on some room export endpoints, but those will probably go fast now that I have the format down and everything's working. I fixed the sidecar login, so there were some cookie issues with the sort of new flag where they don't share across domains. So I fixed that up, and now you can log in again. And then over the weekend, one of the Mongo database servers died. So I'll be working this week to spin it back up. Everything's working fine right now because we have 2 other ones, but I want to get that working so the voting and arbiter stuff is fine.
Cool. So the same site, none, that's a recent change that landed in Chrome, I think, as a default. Was there any interesting things that came out of that work?
It's the one thing that happened before that we encountered with it is our old desktop site, that attribute breaks old Chrome instances so that the cookie just doesn't work. And that doesn't affect a lot of people because Chrome auto updates for everyone. But in our old desktop site, we used an old NWJS version, which pulled in old Chromium. And so that we had also login problems there. So we just had to update it. But it seems like a huge web change that broke many things. So it makes things safer now, but just a bit weird. People are having to share cookies all around. Get around it.
All right. Right. Over to Lauren for an update on what's happening in growth marketing world.
Pretty short update this week. Hoping to get redirect testing re-enabled. Before we had a staging environment where you test redirects, and we're going to get those applied to review apps. And that'll be cool for the handbook also. And then still working on the proof of concepts for our CMS integration. And that project will be ongoing over the next couple of weeks.
Cool. All right. Looking forward to seeing the outcome of those concepts. On to product update, Eric Schutter.
Yeah, so you already mentioned this. I'm getting excited for the group conversation. It is going to be our first one, which is, so I don't know what to expect. I don't know who's going to show up, who's going to be interested, and what kind of questions there will be, but I'm excited to field them all. It would be great if you could join, but it's certainly not required. I know time zones and other meetings could come up. I hope we get some good questions. That's really all I have. If you could look at the slides, if you feel like you want to review them for accuracy and whether they make sense. Jean was nice enough to provide some context and add some links late last week because I procrastinated on making the slides, but I think they're pretty much complete. So some last minute eyes would be great though. I will be posting in the next hour, most likely, the slides to the team. I will also be combining that with an announcement about the static site editor being available on the whole handbook. So that'll be a big celebration. I don't want to gloss over that too much because that's what we've been working towards for 6 months now. This is really, really, really great. I'm very excited and I'm very proud of the team for getting here so quickly. Yeah, it's just a big moment. I think we should all kind of celebrate in our own ways today, if you can. And hopefully we'll get a ton of users and a ton of great feedback, and we'll be able to keep iterating. I don't think it, it's hard to celebrate shipping remotely, and it's hard to celebrate shipping when you're already moving on like 2 releases past what you're about to announce. But it's a big moment. So thank you, everybody. And I will leave the rest of the time for our engineering conversation.
Eric. Yeah, it feels like we should do a pizza social call or something next week to celebrate properly. All right, so I'm going to share my screen so that it's easier for you all to follow. Just share. Okay. Can you all see my screen fine? Let me zoom in one or two levels. All right. So, as mentioned, editing front matter is the main feature that we're targeting in Industry 13.4. My hope is that we can land an initial kind of like feature iteration that would essentially pretty much just be the showing what the front matter field and values are in input boxes, allowing somebody to edit it. From my initial conversations with Derek, it should fit in nicely with the way he already has ripping out of front matter and stitching it back together when we create the MR. And so I'm hopeful that we should have fairly smooth kind of like first iteration. That said, we don't know until we know. And this week, when Derek is back, he'll be focusing on the planning. What I wanted to talk about, and I'm just looking for the design that Michael did. I can't see it. Here we go. So I wanted to just quickly bring this up. So this is the initial concept that Michael worked on. And he's currently working on a solution validation prototype, and we'll be doing some testing with users on this. But I wanted to just provide this for some context for this discussion. So essentially, you'll see a kind of like settings icon here. Whether this kind of like icon is sufficient in terms of knowing what to do is things that will come out of the solution validation. But when you kind of like click on it, the initial idea was that it would open like a drawer that essentially just displays the key value pairs of the front matter of the file. And this would simply be plain text to start off with. Down the line, we have ideas of, say, for instance, you have a blog post and you have a bunch of categories or tags that you want to add to a blog post. You might want to be able to have a multi-select or a drop-down with values. Maybe you have a bunch of layouts that users can choose from. And so you might want to have a drop-down with the layouts instead of them having to try and remember what the values are. So anyway, we have predefined values, you might want to consider that. And that's something that we need to figure out how we're going to do still. Our initial thoughts around that was around providing a configuration file for the static site editor, where you could define, for instance, maybe you don't want certain front matter fields to be editable even. And so you might want to define which fields are editable or not editable, and you might want to define predetermined values for them. So those are things that will come in probably in the second iteration, but things that we will keep in mind when we do the planning, so that we kind of like architect a solution that can cover for all of those things. What I wanted to really talk about in today's session and get some opinions on is one of the key decisions we need to make, in my mind anyway, is where we deal with the parsing processing of the front matter. And when I refer to that, is think let's take the handbook page, for instance. So as soon as I click on this link here, it takes me to the static site editor. And by the time it lands here, this editor, by the time it shows things, needs to know what those key value pairs are that's in the front matter. So currently it just strips it out and it stitches it back together when you submit your changes. One question that I have is, should we be doing the parsing of the front matter values in the key value pairs in the front end, or should we be parsing those values by the back end and having it passed to the static site editor as parameters? If we do go the configuration file route, I guess the same question comes. Do we have the backend pass the values from the configuration file to the front end, or does the front end make the call for a configuration file and read those values? And that's essentially the question I want to get you all today is, what are the considerations that we need to have in terms of having the logic all on the front end, which is where most of the logic lies right now. I think the backend is the only logic it really kind of like handles right now is whether a file is editable or not. And that's merely based on supported file types right now. It obviously does, as part of the whole coming into GitLab, it checks whether you have permission and all of those things. So the consideration really is where does it make sense to have some of this processing logic, I guess, in the back end? If so, what type of processing should we have there, or should we have it all in the front end? And if the consideration is to have it in the front end, what are the type of things that we expect the back end to handle for us in terms of the static site editor? And so that's the kind of like setup question that I'm and context that I'm giving you, and I'd like to hear some thoughts on this, if you please.
How much does the web IDE parse stuff? Not the static site editor, but the web IDE.
I'm not sure. As far as it's actually. As far as I know, it loads a lot of things. Like for instance, this is it uses, I believe they use GraphQL on the web IDE already. I'm not 100% sure actually, but I believe most of it is actually done with API calls on the front end. I'll probably double check this. GraphQL. So GraphQL for user permissions. Let's go back here. Merge request. It seems like it would seem a lot of things of the config. Most things are probably fetched on the client from the client side. I don't know if somebody has the GitLab source code open and could have a look to see if there's a lot of things passed to the editor or not.
So
but
I think
to your point, sorry, Enrique, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh no, please finish your thoughts.
No, I was just going to say, to Eric's point, I think looking at how the web IDE approaches this is definitely a good starting point. And then, if they do it in a whichever way, which I'm hoping Enrique has an answer, it would be good to reach out to Paul and Dennis and hear what their experience has been so far with that approach, and whether if they had a blank canvas today, whether they would approach it differently.
So I think that we should evaluate what are the benefits of doing it on each side. So if we do parsing in the backend, what benefits we get with that decision? And I don't have enough information to to give, to provide to make or to provide any advantages on that side. I think that the advantage that we get when we do parsing in the front end is control mostly. So you have the raw source, and then you do the parsing in the client. You get the abstract syntax tree that is like taking raw information and converting it into unstructured data in a data structure, and then you can make transformations on it. So that's probably the advantage that we get from there. But I think from a high level point of view, we should go a little bit deeper and try to evaluate and investigate what advantage we get from doing it on each side or the other.
I would say one of the potential benefits of doing parsing by the backend could potentially be performance. So I think we need to keep in mind that one of our objectives long term is to have the static site editor be usable on mobile phones. And while we currently not focusing too much on that, the more processing we offload to the front end, the more CPU usage will be needed on the mobile device, and that in itself, I think in this specific instance, because the front matter is not visible immediately, we could potentially delay the processing of that to after the editor is bootstrapped, to not kind of like delay the rendering of it. But for other things that we might like, say for instance, we talk a little bit more generic, so it's a configuration file. Would we want to parse that configuration file purely on the client? Because and maybe we can, and maybe it's fine. Maybe we can use web workers to help us with performance and like that. But I think performance is probably the one consideration you would have, and not so much from a desktop or laptop computer point of view, but mostly from a mobile point of view. The less processing you have to do on the mobile device, the better, both from an actual performance, but also from a power consumption point of view.
I don't know if this would help steer the conversation, but if I could just share maybe a little bit of the strategy or long-term vision I had in this, and you kind of mentioned in the beginning, I think it'd be great for the end users down the road to be able to configure this in a more upfront and sort of line-by-line manner. So if I have front matter that is an array of values, I could identify the values that it might support, say like different templates. That might be something we can infer and build. It might be something that somebody wants to provide. It might be great to say this is like this is a binary true false, so I want it to be a switch. It might also be really important for some of them to be required versus optional, or have pre-filled values versus freeform. That level of configuration seems like it would be great to have for the users. I don't know if that would inform at what point we set up that configuration, whether it needs to be more upfront and done in the back end and handled in a configuration file versus parsing it and inferring a lot of this from the values. We can maybe, obviously we're going to iterate towards that step, but if it informs the architecture, I think that's the direction we should be heading, is allowing people to say, allowing our users to say, this front matter is required, this front matter is optional, and as a text description, this front matter is an array of values that could take these three options.
I also want to share.
Oh, sorry, Wesley, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to share some thoughts about it. I think there's like two questions. First one is about front matter, and second one is about the configuration for front matter and for other parts. In case of front matter, I think we already parsing the file and we get this front matter kind of for free, unless I'm wrong. So from this perspective, I think it doesn't really matter like if it's on the backend side or if it's on the front-end side. Because on the front-end side, currently we parse a whole file and we parse a front matter from it. So unless there are some kind of like obstacles with dealing with the front matter on the front-end side, I think we can keep it there, at least for now. And we can also evaluate how much performance we can get if we move it to the backend. For the configuration, I think it's a bit different because the configuration file, first of all, we need to validate it, and probably we don't want to have this logic on the front end. And it might be transformed to from the like configuration file to some kind of like intermediate variant with some kind of like options and keys that can be useful for the front end, not to deal with a raw file, which need to be like separately loaded, parsed, validated, and added all of this configuration to the static site editor. So I think for the configuration, the backend will be a better option.
Yes, my thoughts go in the same line. We don't want to provide a raw configuration file to the front end. I imagine that we are gonna make a version that perhaps transforms the array of options that we will provide for the layout field into something that is like clean, something that transforms those paths to something that is a label plus the actual file of the path, the actual path of the file. So I think I agree with that, with those thoughts of Pacific.
I'm
Yes.
going to jump in here and just add, I really like the idea of a configuration file and being able to apply uniform front matter across the site. Even our www repo, our front matter, it's crazy amongst the marketing site. It varies tremendously. So being able to make that consistent would be awesome.
Yeah, so having listened to Vasily's argument, I think it makes sense. It also, if I recall, aligns with my initial conversations with Derek, where his opinion was also to keep the parsing of the front matter on the front end, because it's already there. Like Vasily said, you get it for free. You don't need to make a separate request and so on. And as far as the config go, I think your points of it having to be parsed and validated and probably transformed to options that the editor would expect, definitely I can see it going that way. So I think making that distinction between config on the back end and parse on the back end and pass to the editor, and anything source streams that's part of the source gets processed by the front end, because that's already where we have that logic going. I think that makes a lot of sense, and seems like a nice clean divider as well for us to use as a kind of like a I don't want to call it a rule, but a guide going forward as well. All right, thank you very much, everybody. With that, we are at time. I'm very glad that we got to discuss that point, because that pushes our planning a little bit forward on that issue already. So have a great rest of your Monday, and see you all on the group call tomorrow, where we will watch Eric sweat.